In part 4 of this lecture, we explored a coding example that showed how the $scope inheritance works in Angular. In this lecture, we'll continue with that coding example, but now use the controller as syntax. Okay, so let's go back to the code editor, and what we'll do, not to convolute our logging statements, let's go ahead and comment this whole thing out. And what we'll do this time is go to our index.html and we'll uncomment the couple of controllers that we have here. So what we do here is we have a couple of controllers. One is a controller called parent controller 2, and in this time we're using the controller as syntax and giving that controller a label, and we'll call it parent. We could call it whatever we want. And then if you look down here, we have another ng controller, which is child controller 2, and we're giving it a label of child. So since any properties that are going to be added now to the scope are not going to be added directly to the $scope, but going to be added to the $scope dot parent property or dot parent object, and since we know that we don't need to actually mention $scope, that property that is sitting on the $scope, which is the parent property, can now be referenced directly in our HTML template. So we could say parent.value, assuming there's a value property on that parent object. And we could also say here child.value. Let's go to app.js and take a look as to what our controllers look like. So first of all, here we have our parent controller 2. And it's kind of a best practice to try to name this variable that we're going to kind of attach all kinds of properties to the same as the label inside of your HTML template. You don't have to do it. Some people actually name it VM for view model, but I like to keep it at the same name as the label I gave in the HTML template. But what you name it here makes absolutely no difference because this is just a local variable and you're just using it instead of having to say this everywhere. Some people say this everywhere, but this is a little bit more clear to read. So what I'm doing here is I'm saying parent.value equals 1, which means I'm assigning a property called value to the instance of this parent controller 2. Now note that even though I have this scope here injected, I really don't need it here, and it's probably actually left over here because I was doing console log statements. But since I have no console log statements that in the parent controller 2 that I want to log the $scope to the console, I'm just going to go ahead and take it out altogether. We don't really need it because the scope is provided, we're just not using it anywhere because we're attaching the properties directly to the instance of the controller itself. And it's AngularJS that is taking the instance of this controller and assigning it to the $scope for us behind the scene. Now let's take a look at the child controller 2, and the only reason again I'm injecting scope here is because this time I'm actually going to log the scope so we could just look at it. But really I don't really need it here at all unless I'm specifically using it for something. And here the construct is exactly the same. We're declaring a local variable that is the same name as the label that we declared our controller with in the HTML template, and we're creating a property on that object called value, which is exactly the same name as the property of the parent. However, since we're assigning it to the instance of the controller in both cases, this value in no way is going to mask this value, which means as long as we reference the proper controller, these values can work independently. And all we're doing here is we're going to go ahead and dump the scope object to the console so we can take a look. Let's save that for a second and let's go back to the index.html and see what we're doing here. As you can see, it's much easier to read as to what's going here as well. Since parent is being assigned as a property on our $scope by AngularJS, I can now reference parent.value and reference child.value here as well. Let's go ahead and save that and go to the browser. And you can see that the parent value here is 1, as we expected it to be, and the child value of the child inner controller is 5. Now let's go ahead and take a look at the child's scope object. If we open it up a little bit here, we could see that we have a child property that is equal to the child controller 2 instance. And we could see here, if we open it up, that is value equal to 5. Now if we go ahead and traverse its prototype chain, right here, we'll see that its prototype has a parent property, and that parent property is equal to parent controller 2 instance. And we could see here that its value is 1. So if we go back to the code editor, you'll see how much easier it is now to even reference properties of our parent controller in our inner child controller. So for example, I could say here parent value, and I can reference now the parent controller, since parent is something that got inherited as part of the prototype chain. So parent.value. And if we do this and go back to our browser, you'll see that the parent value is 1, and it's the same parent value that we retrieved right here, even though this parent value is being mentioned inside of our child controller. So this way, it's much easier to read. You see here that we're actually referencing some property that belongs to this particular controller. So it's easier to read, easier to debug, and you could see where these properties are coming from. So let's summarize. First of all, please don't think that all these numerous concepts that we learned as part of this lecture are only applicable to understanding the controller as syntax. What we learned is applicable throughout AngularJS framework and really throughout JavaScript in general. So let's review. Inheritance in general is used for code reuse and sometimes to express a relationship between entities. Prototypal inheritance in JavaScript is based on object instances rather than classes. In general, prototypal inheritance is much simpler than a class-based inheritance, having only a couple of rules to know. First, the child's object's properties are inherited from the parent and are looked up through the prototype chain, so they are actually not sitting directly on the child. Second, the property can be local if it's declared on the child object itself with the same name as the parent and therefore masking the parent's property. Now when it comes to AngularJS, the $scope is based on prototypal inheritance, which means that a child controller's $scope inherits from the parent controller's $scope. So if you have two nested controllers, the inner controller's scope is prototypically inherited from the outer controller's scope. Now when it comes to controller as syntax, it's very simple. It's the controller name ng-controller equals controller name as, and you give it a specific label. Angular then creates a property with that same label name on the $scope that belongs to that controller. The label name becomes a reference to this keyword, in other words, the instance of the controller function. Now the reason that works is because when we call .controller to declare our controller in AngularJS, the .controller treats our controller function as a function constructor. So when you start declaring properties that you want to share between your view model, the controller, and the HTML template, you attach them directly to the controller instance. In other words, you attach them to the this keyword, not the $scope. With the controller as syntax, the syntax in our HTML templates as well as our JavaScript code becomes much simpler, and we no longer have to deal with the masking that can occur with the prototypal inheritance, making the code much simpler to write.